Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma-Informed Church Kid Podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. Now we are diving deeper, getting nerdy and dirty, as we explore a more detailed description of spiritual beings. First of all, I want to spend a little bit of time discussing why this matters, especially through a trauma-informed reading of Scripture. The biggest reason why this matters is something to which I alluded in the last podcast episode. An understanding of demons, demonology, and spiritual warfare that is quite ubiquitous within Christianity broadly and American Christianity in particular. I am led to understand that there is a heavy emphasis on spiritual warfare and demons in Roman Catholicism, and while it is not quite as obvious nor as systematized, this is also a strong feature of Eastern Orthodoxy. However, my personal experience is limited to Protestant Christianity, so whenever I say the word Christian in this podcast, just substitute that niche for the whole. I mean no disrespect nor distortion toward other traditions. I intend only to pass over them in silence, in order to defer to others who are more knowledgeable than I. In my experience of Christianity, there was a strong fear of demons and evil spiritual beings. I say fear, knowing full well that people from my tradition would not frame it that way. They would say that they mean for us to simply have a healthy awareness, knowing that we have an enemy who commands hostile armies, and that we should rest secure in the victory while fighting the good fight until the final victory. However, as is frequently the case in spiritual trauma, there is a difference between what is said and what is heard. I'm quite sympathetic to all those who bear the burden of teaching and leading. This is something that I myself feel strongly, even doing this podcast and working as I do with vulnerable populations and people. I get and acknowledge that they are doing the best they can, by and large, with the knowledge and communication tools they have. I do not intend any of the subsequent descriptions of the effects to become judgments on the character or intentions of the people. These are good people with good hearts, again, by and large. But that doesn't change the fact that sometimes people who genuinely love us also harm us. Well-intentioned toxic theology is still toxic theology. Life is complicated and hard. There are not binaries of oppressor and victim, innocent and guilty. We all share solidarity in sin. Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Anyone who has grown up at the turn of the millennium is likely to remember Frank Peretti. I actually loved his books and read them well past my college years. He has two major works, This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness, both of which have been foundational in my mental image of the spiritual realm. In those books, the spiritual world is presented essentially as if it is the material world, only hidden behind a veil and unseen to all mortals except those with the eyes to see and ears to hear. There are demons with visible form and composition, as there are angels, both of whom are fundamentally humanoid in shape and activity. Their warfare is depicted as constituted of wielding literal swords and other weapons, albeit of a subtle or ethereal quality, on the outcome of which hangs the destiny of individual human souls. This is, in many ways, a perfectly ordinary and understandable way to depict the spiritual realm. It aligns with much of medieval scholasticism and such classic works as the Divine Comedy or Paradise Lost. Additionally, it seems to, on the surface, be reflective of the language of the Scriptures. There is plenty of above for heaven and below for Hades or of battle imagery to describe spiritual warfare, up to and including Paul discussing literal armor in Ephesians 6. Demons and angels both speak. At least angels are depicted as walking, eating, and in other sensory ways interacting with the material world. Honestly, I get the appeal and understand its sense. But I don't think that this is in any way the best framing device for the spiritual realm. The best way I see to understand the spiritual realm is as the noetic realm. This is a fancy adjective based off of the Greek word nous. For those of you playing at home, that is spelled N-O-U-S, which roughly translates as mind. Essentially, whenever we read biblical descriptions of angels or demons, and frankly anything divine, I think that the best way to think of this as being something which exists within the world of mind. Now, does this mean that I think these things are not real? Of course not. I remember how at the end of the last Harry Potter book, and here I guess there's a 20-plus year spoiler alert, so yeah? Anyway, Dumbledore and Harry are having a conversation. Harry asks him, "Is this real? Or has this been happening inside my head?" Dumbledore smiles and says, "Of course it is happening inside your head, Harry. But why on earth should that mean that it is not real?" That is precisely how I view the noetic world. Angels, demons, and other spiritual beings are real. This reality, however, is best understood not as a separate plane or dimension of material reality, but a different kind of reality altogether, the reality of mind. For those of you who are wondering, that makes me a realist and not a nominalist. I won't define those terms in depth, but I would recommend to you a Nathan Jacobs podcast episode, which I will link in the show notes. Suffice it to say that what this means is that mental constructions are not simply mental fictions. They're real, actual, living, substantive things, which map onto and/or participate in realities which exist in the noetic world. But let's take a concrete example to make this a little bit more relevant. I work with people all the time who experience what are known as intrusive thoughts. These are thoughts which pop into our minds without any real conscious choice. They are thoughts which often surprise, shock, or even repulse us. They could be thoughts about hurting ourselves or others. They could be hateful or vindictive thoughts, again, about ourselves or others. They could be a momentary curiosity or interest, something that catches your eye or some other sense organ. They could be lustful thoughts or some other element of desire or appetite, etc. These thoughts could also be positive, as in the case of a moment of inspiration, although in such cases they are not referred to as intrusive but welcomed. You'll notice the etymology of that word, inspiration. It contains the word spirit within it, which conveys precisely the point I am trying to make. These thoughts, all of them, can be viewed as coming from spirits, either malevolent or benevolent. Does that mean that everything that happens within our minds is the product of unseen angels or demons pulling the strings? No, because there is a distinction between thoughts and ideas. A thought is a product of inspiration. An idea is a thought which is developed within us, by us. To put it simply, a thought is monergistic, one energy of one spirit acting upon us, whereas an idea is synergistic, our spirit working with another spirit. And this matters quite a bit in the real world. I have worked with people whose thoughts point them in the direction of panic, chronic anxiety, depression, and suicide. "What if I mess this up?" pops unbidden and unwanted in their head, followed immediately by, "That will prove your dad was right about you," followed almost simultaneously by, "You really are a loser who nobody cares about." There is a moment within this sequence where awareness comes in, the observation that one is having a thought happen to them, and a judgment of that thought is either good or bad, desirable or undesirable. This moment of awareness is the person, the self, the me, or what we would call consciousness, whereas the thought itself simply is not, at least not directly and voluntarily. What we do with that thought, however, becomes who we are. If I have a lustful thought happen to me, and I decide to let that seed fall to the ground, cover it with dirt, water it, cultivate the plant that grows from it, and then eat the fruit which emerges from that tree of knowing, that thought, which once was alien to me, has now become part of my matrix of personhood. I have surrendered my will within my spirit to its will. Genuinely and frankly, I have surrendered my will to the will of a different spirit. Of course, this could work in either direction, toward my destruction or toward my salvation. The question is not about if I am cooperating with a different spirit. The question is about with which spirit I am cooperating and what its intentions toward my person are. I hear some of you saying, wait just a second. Are you saying that everyone is either demon-possessed or angel-possessed? No, not at all. Because we are describing a sliding scale of synergy here. That's a tongue twister. Not an on-off switch, which entails either myself or something else. The degree to which we participate in these thoughts determines the degree to which they are our thoughts. I still don't mean that possessive in the sense that we generate or create those thoughts. They continue to be generated or created external to us. However, that sense of external gets very fuzzy when our internal individual world so closely resembles the external spiritual world. This is because human beings are hybrid creatures, part spirit, part material body, who are designed to be permeable to the spiritual world. We are supposed to have our spirit interacting with other spirits. In fact, it is precisely this capability which makes possible our salvation, as Paul discusses in Romans 8 when he talks about walking by or in or with the Spirit of Christ. It is also this capability which makes possible our destruction, as I alluded to in one of the last Nerd Alert episodes about the second death. Those who participate in and with the spirits of order and life will be ever more closely conformed to that pattern, and thereby be made more and more justified and vivified. To use a biblical term, the holy ones or saints, the deified members of Adonai's divine council. Those who participate in and with the spirits of chaos and death will be ever more closely conformed to that pattern, possibly up to the point where the line between the demonized human and the devil and his angels has disappeared altogether. What this means in the context of spiritual beings is that we are all, whether Christian or not, participating in our salvation or not, influenced by both angels and demons. We are permeable creatures by nature. There is no escape from that. We cannot stand outside of the matrix of noetic influence. That is why a deep dive into understanding spiritual beings is so critical to both daily life and also healing and recovery from spiritual trauma. First of all, let's not delude ourselves about the agendas of the spiritual beings aligned with chaos and death. Their goal is to steal, kill, and destroy. Their methods are deception, corruption, and addiction, and they are in every sense of the word the traumatizers of our souls. This is why in the discussion of the armor of God we referenced earlier, Paul says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Ephesians 6:12. It is very true to say that no human is truly our enemy. Our enemies are the forces of darkness standing behind, and sometimes living within, those flesh and blood images of God. That is why healing from spiritual trauma begins with a recognition that we have been traumatized, each and every one of us, and that we are in a world at war. The proper response to this recognition of trauma, as is the proper response to any recognition of trauma, is not to react out of survival instinct and hypervigilant fear. Even though every fiber of our being is screaming for this reaction as the best way to keep us safe, anyone who lived through the satanic panic of the 80s knows there is nothing safe about seeing the world in this way. Or the paranoia of the 90s, which was convinced that touching the wrong objects or listening to the wrong music or walking into the wrong spaces would somehow attach a demon to you, and you would then be afflicted by them because you ignorantly invited it. or the Pharisaism of the early 2000s, which was so concerned with purity and protecting vulnerable and weak teenagers that it created legalistic fences around all the media and behaviors deemed to be playing with fire, which extended to books such as Harry Potter, but was also the impetus for the purity culture of the time, or even to the more recent waves of charismatic expressions of Christianity, concerned with casting out demons during regular Sunday services and building up entire systems such as so-called deliverance ministry and the like. None of these reactionary responses cultivated a sense of health, safety, security, or actual purity. Quite the opposite, in fact. The deconstruction movement we see now is directly tied into each of these in one way or another. A fearful response to a feared stimulus only increases fear of the stimulus. Always. But neither does the spiritual ostrich approach work. That is, to stick one's head in the spiritual sand, either through a materialistic rejection of all that woo-woo stuff, or through some sort of pious spiritual bypassing. I don't need to worry about any of that stuff because I am covered in the blood. Or, Jesus has the victory, so no need to concern myself. Or, just have enough faith and it will all go away. These all fail precisely because they deny the fundamental reality of our natures. We are permeable creatures. Or, if they accept that and instead assert that the real Christian will never be afflicted or can resist temptation easily, then they're denying the fundamental reality of our experience. No one has ever had a life like that. Even Christ himself was tempted, and that is seen by the author of Hebrews, not as a one-off way of showing his one-time, once-for-all victory over it, but as directly constitutive of his continuing identification with us, and us with him. Far from this being a substitutionary thing where he is tempted so we don't need to undergo temptation any longer, this is portrayed as himself as the forerunner, the one whose experience of temptation redeems our own experience of temptation. Here is the author in chapter 4, verses 15 through 16. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help us in time of need. See also 6:19 through 20, 10:19 through 21, 13:12 through 13. This aligns with the experience of any ascetic, monk, or any other holy person in the Christian tradition. If anything, their attempts to draw closer to the throne of grace result in more attacks of spiritual warfare and temptation. This is not at all the result of some Freudian over-restrictive conscience, a kind of overactive superego. Rather, it is the ever-present reality of all of us, which is for most of us veiled to the eyes of our soul, i.e. our nous. When I talk to clients about setting boundaries, I warn them, unhealthy systems do not welcome healthy behavior. The same is true in the spiritual realm. Diseased and decaying spiritual beings do not welcome steps toward a person becoming healed and whole. All this is to say the following. We should not see influence by spiritual beings as evidence of anything bad in us. It is evidence of nothing other than simply our humanity. And if this influence is pervasive and persistent, particularly when coupled with great internal distress at the thoughts which accompany it, that is arguably because the person under duress is closer to the throne of grace, not further away from it. It was only because the devil saw a genuine rival in Adam and Eve that he led them into sin, after all. The deuterocanonical book Wisdom of Solomon puts it this way. For Adonai created us for incorruption and made us in the image of his own nature. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his company experience it. Chapter 2, verses 23 through 24. This is why our status as the targets of his malice should not cause us either surprise or fear. He cannot harm or hurt Adonai in any way, but he can deface and despoil the images of Adonai. And the primary way in which this happens is through the influence of spiritual beings, those who already belong to his company, and for which company he is actively recruiting willing participants among humans. This is the other way in which healing from spiritual trauma depends on a proper understanding of spiritual beings. When we realize that the victory of Christ is universal, that no spiritual being has any claim on or rights over any flesh and blood, because Christ has deified and sanctified flesh and blood, that gives us enormous power over them. It means that the only authority they have over us is the power we give over to them. This is why I spent some time at the beginning unpacking the concepts of thoughts, ideas, and identity. I usually draw for my clients a feedback loop visual, which you can see in the show notes, that describes a 3-step psychosomatic process: stimulus, reaction, and response. The stimulus is whatever external event happens to us. This external event could be material, such as someone calling us a derogatory name, pushing our buttons, stealing something from us, etc. Or it could be spiritual. As we've already discussed, this is what intrusive thoughts are. The stimulus simply is what it is, and we have very little to no control over what stimulus we will be assaulted with on any given day. We can take some limited steps to control our external environment, example, move away, cut off friendships, etc., but there are no guarantees. This is why efforts to stop the stimuli from coming in are very often doomed to disappointment at best and despair at worst. They aim to control what cannot be controlled. Similarly, our instinctive and automatic reactions cannot be controlled. This does not mean that they will always be the same, or as strong as they ever were, or that we are doomed to a life perpetually just as it is now. What it does mean is that our instinctive and innate reactions to these stimuli are conditioned precognitively. They are built from our attachment patterns, our matrix of meaning which we have built with very little conscious control, and our cultural and genetic proclivities. So, to direct our energy at removing this is also likely to result in varying degrees of failure and futility. What is to be done about it then? The goal, I submit, should be to focus on changing our response to our reaction to the stimuli we encounter, whether material or spiritual. This constitutes nothing less than our spirits cooperating with the right spiritual beings, those which are aligned with order and life, and ultimately the Spirit of Christ himself. By rightly reordering our psychosomatic responses in accordance with the thoughts and desires and interests and appetites of the correct spiritual beings, we create a feedback loop that either reinforces or degrades the superstructure of our instinctive reactions to these stimuli. But that's all really complicated jargon. Let's take a concrete example. My daughter is in full-on teenager mode at only 7, nearly 8 years old. That is the material stimuli which I experience on a daily basis. No, I will not do that. The crossed arms, the pouting, angry face, the running away and slamming the bedroom door, etc. Accompanying this set of material stimuli is a set of spiritual stimuli. Thoughts such as, what are you going to do about it? You have to show her you're the boss. You can't let her get away with that. This will only make her think she can do whatever she wants. If you do nothing about it now, it'll only get worse, and think how bad it will be in 10 years, etc. And then come my instinctive and innate reactions to these stimuli. Anger, helpless frustration, despair that I have failed to properly enact a successful routine, regret that I forgot a critical step in the process, embarrassment for being in public and wondering what people will think of me or her, fear for her future relationships with this same behavior, etc. I think that all of these are spiritual events just as much as they are physical events, because I myself am a hybrid being of both the material and the spiritual. The thoughts are coming from spiritual beings. They map onto my level of participation with, or resistance to, those same thoughts in the past. And all of it together creates the response that Paul in Romans 7 calls the law of sin and death in my flesh. The Greek word for that is sarx. This is not about the body being bad, or my spiritual state being depraved. This is about being a permeable human being with an innate and inseverable connection to and desire for God as the only good. However, my ability to perceive that good is distorted and diffused. The moment I recognize the good I want to do and the juxtaposition of that with the evil I do not want to do, I have a choice. How will I respond? And that is the moment of identity formation. Not one single choice that determines for all eternity who I will be, but an infinite number of infinitely branching choices, each of which carry some small iota of the weight of self-determination. In a single word, this is the concept of the will and free will. I can, quite literally, create myself. I can only do this with the tools of creation with which I have been gifted by God, but it is a genuine sub-creation nonetheless. And it is only free insofar as I make the choice which is aligned with the final goal, purpose, and destiny of my being. In Greek, this is described as the telos, the answer to the question why of any person or thing. That means that the freedom does not consist in my being rid of all spiritual influence, whether demonic or angelic, a sort of nonsensical and non-human, impermeable island of individuality. I can only be self-determining when the self who is doing the determining is most self-like, which is to say, most Christ-like. Anything else is some degree of slavery and is not freedom. The freedom of an acorn is to become an oak tree. The freedom of a human is to become a saint. We are already spiritual beings. We just need to become the right kind of spiritual beings through cooperation with the right kind of spiritual beings in this life. Any movement away from that is not actually toward an increase of selfhood. It is toward a decrease and diminution and destruction of selfhood. By listening to the voices of crooked and serpentine spiritual beings, I am surrendering to non-being. In contrast, by listening to the voices of godlike spiritual beings, I am surrendering to being itself. That is why Jesus says seemingly uncomfortable and shocking things like, "Whoever loves his life will lose it, but whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for the life of the age." John 12:25. See also Matthew 10:39, 16:25, Luke 9:24, 17:33, Mark 8:35. This does not mean a self-righteous asceticism, a kind of Gnostic spirituality that can't wait to be rid of this gross flesh. What it means is that making the life of this age our telos will only result in a vector away from ultimate teleology and a spiraling descent into non-being. When we realize that this life is given to us for one purpose, to become like God, we submit more readily to those spiritual beings who are already further along that teleological continuum toward godlikeness than we are. That means that we dignify and honor and zealously caretake and guard our life and body in this age, not because it is the best thing we have, but because it is part of what Christ himself took on and thereby sanctified and deified. Therefore, it is worthy of the highest honor, the foremost expression of which is to, quote, honor God with your body, end quote. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20. That is what true freedom looks like, to be who and what you were created to become. So, explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay, ready? Humans are creatures who live in the spiritual world, for good or evil. Our primary access to that spiritual world and its beings are through our minds. The war for our minds and hearts is nonetheless both very real and subject to our wills, if, that is, our wills are truly free. I hope that this walk through what a spiritual being is, how it operates, what it means to be influenced by them, and how we can be truly free in a world at war has been helpful for you. I don't presume to have covered everything, and if I feel that there is enough content and desire for it, I may yet do another episode on spiritual beings, this time one that gets much more nerdy and taxonomic. This time around, I just want to be as practical as I can. That's why this is kind of a nerd alert and a how of hurt episode mashed together. I am convinced and convicted that the lessons we learn about the Bible are not just ideological grenades. They are the very stuff of either everyday health and life or a slow death. I pray that this episode has been life-giving for you. I want to close with an extended section from C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, very apropos for an episode on spiritual beings, angels, and demons. For those of you who don't know, the conceit of the book is that a senior demon is writing letters to a junior tempter, giving it advice about how to effectively destroy the human to whom this tempter is assigned. Keep in mind as you hear it that the perspective is totally inverted. The enemy is God, the patient is the human, and all approbations are expressed as mirror distortions of the divine reality. I hope it helps you glimpse the overlap of the spiritual and material worlds a little bit more clearly, as it has for me. Now it may surprise you to learn that in the enemy's efforts to get permanent possession of a soul, he relies on the troughs even more than on the peaks. Some of his special favorites have gone through longer and deeper troughs than anyone else. The reason is this. To us, a human is primarily food. Our aim is the absorption of its will into ours, the increase of our own area of selfhood at its expense. But the obedience which the enemy demands of men is quite a different thing. One must face the fact that all the talk about his love for men and his service being perfect freedom is not, as one would gladly believe, mere propaganda, but an appalling truth. He really does want to fill the universe with a lot of loathsome little replicas of himself, creatures whose life, on its miniature scale, will be qualitatively like his own, not because he has absorbed them, but because their wills freely conform to his. We want cattle who can finally become food. He wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in. He wants to give out. We are empty and would be filled. He is full and flows over. Our war aim is a world in which our Father below has drawn all other beings into himself. The enemy wants a world full of beings united to him, but still distinct. And that is where the troughs come in. You must have often wondered why the enemy does not make more use of his power to be sensibly present to human souls in any degree he chooses and at any moment. But you now see that the irresistible and indisputable are the two weapons which the very nature of his scheme forbids him to use. Merely to override a human will, as his felt presence in any but the faintest and most mitigated degree would certainly do, would be for him useless. He cannot ravish, he can only woo. For his ignoble idea is to eat the cake and have it. The creatures are to be one with him, yet be themselves. Merely to cancel them or assimilate them will not serve. He is prepared to do a little overriding at the beginning. He will set them off with communications of his presence, which, though faint, seem great to them, with emotional sweetness and easy conquest over temptation. But he never allows the state of affairs to last long. Sooner or later, he withdraws, if not in fact, at least from their conscious experience, all those supports and incentives. He leaves the creature to stand up on its own legs, to carry out from the will alone duties which have lost all relish. It is during such trough periods, much more than during the peak periods, that it is growing into the sort of creature he wants it to be. Hence the prayers offered in the state of dryness are those which please him best. We can drag our patients along by continual tempting, because we design them only for the table, and the more their will is interfered with, the better. He cannot tempt to virtue as we do to vice. He wants them to learn to walk, and must therefore take away his hand. And if only the will to walk is really there, he is pleased even with their stumbles. Do not be deceived, Wormwood. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do our enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. My challenge to you all is simple and straightforward. If you look out on the universe from which every trace of God seems to have vanished and ask why you have been forsaken, you are not alone. Despite this, please continue to obey, just as Christ did. I cannot tell you when it will get better, or even if it will, but your broken heart is, by definition, close to the throne of grace. It is only for the poor in spirit that the blessing of seeing God is reserved. And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean, so you can find the HQ for all podcast content on churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started and get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give it a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give me any respect. And without those sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media at ChurchKidPod, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback and to improve wherever I can. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.